Hi, I'm Tess.
Hi, I'm Marissa.
We did our project on macroeconomic equilibrium.
We are going to teach you about the economy when it is in long-run equilibrium, when it is in a recession, when it is in a stagflation, and when it is in an inflation.
Stay tuned to learn more.
What is long-run equilibrium? Long-run equilibrium is what the economy should ideally look like. It is when the market price equals the quantity demanded to the total quantity supplied by the number of businesses in the industry when each business produces on its long-run supply curve. All businesses are maximizing profits.
Here is a graph of long-run equilibrium. As you can see, there is price level, quantity real GDP, long-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and aggregate supply. What does the y-axis represent? The y-axis represents the price level. This also means the CPI, or Consumer Price Index, or the average change over time in prices paid by consumers for a market basket of goods and services. At equilibrium, Consumer Price Index should be at 3%, falling directly in the middle of the y-axis.
What does the x-axis represent? The x-axis represents the QRGDP, also known as the quantity of real gross domestic product. This is the monetary value of all the finished goods and services produced in the country during a certain period of time, adjusted for inflation. This axis is also representative of employment because as more goods and services are being produced, there must be more people working to do this. So, as QRGDP is going up, so is employment, and vice versa. At full employment, unemployment should be at 5%.
What is long-run aggregate supply? The long-run aggregate supply is the amount of goods and services produced by the economy in a specific period of time. This line is helpful to graph first because it shows us where we want to be, and will help show us when we graph aggregate demand and aggregate supply what type of economy we are in. This line goes straight down the graph and hits the middle of the quantity real GDP axis. It is at equilibrium and shows that unemployment is at 5%.
What is short-run aggregate supply? The short-run aggregate supply is the total supply of goods and services produced in an economy at a certain price level and period of time. This curve shows the relationship between price level and the quantity of output firms provide. This line is positively sloping from left to right because of the sticky wage theory and sticky price theory. Supply shocks that shift this curve include technology, resources or energy, productivity, globalization, and lowered input costs.
Sticky wage theory and sticky price theory. The sticky wage theory is basically when prices fall and firms have long-term contracts with fixed wages for their employers. They are then stuck paying their employers more when they are making less revenue, so they have to cut back production, causing the quantity supplied to fall. The sticky price theory is when prices fall, and if a company doesn't lower their prices, they will be selling less and making less money, causing them to have to cut back production, and quantity supplied will fall. These both work vice versa as well.
The aggregate demand is the amount of goods and services demanded in an economy at a certain price level and period of time. This curve also represents SIGNIX, meaning consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. This curve shows a similar relationship to the short-run aggregate supply curve in that it is the relationship between price level and outputs. However, it is the outputs that firms will provide rather than just how much they do provide. This curve is negatively sloping to the right because of the interest rate effect, the wealth effect, and the net export effect. The shocks to this curve include price of a good, price of a complement, price of a substitute, income, quality, taste, expectations, and number of buyers.
The interest rate effect. The interest rate effect is when there is a lower price level and a decrease in demand for borrowed money. This, in turn, decreases the equilibrium interest rate, which increases investment as well as output because things are cheaper. This also works in the opposite way when there are raised prices. People borrow more money, increasing the interest rate and decreasing investment and output.
The wealth effect is the change in aggregate demand caused by change in the value of assets, such as stocks, bonds, gold, and property. When price level decreases, people have more money and feel wealthy, causing them to spend more, and output also increases. When price level increases, people have less money and feel less wealthy, causing them to spend less, and output decreases. The wealth effect tends to encourage spending and dampen savings.
The net export effect. The net export effect is when there are lower price levels and people buy more American goods. This causes a decrease in the purchase of foreign goods and net exports to increase. The net import-export effect is one of the three effects underlying the negative slope of the aggregate demand curve associated with movement along the aggregate demand curve and a change in aggregate expenditures.
A recession is when there is a big decline in economic activity lasting around 6 to 18 months. This causes a decline in trade and industrial activity. Interest rates tend to fall during a recession to stimulate the economy by offering cheap rates at which to borrow money.
Here's an example of a recessionary graph. There is high unemployment, too low aggregate demand, and too low of a price level. Aggregate demand shifts to the left, which shows the lowering of price level equilibrium as well as quantity real GDP equilibrium.
And inflation is a general increase in prices and a decline in the value of money. This is referred to as demand pull inflation. Central banks try to stop inflation in an attempt to keep the excessive growth of prices to a minimum. As inflation increases, every dollar will buy a smaller percentage of a good.
Here's an example of an inflationary graph. In an inflation, aggregate demand shifts to the right, which shows how the price level equilibrium rises, as well as the quantity real GDP, or employment equilibrium.
A stagflation is when there is a continuous high inflation along with high unemployment and slow economic growth. It is a combination of a recession and inflation. This happens when prices rise but the economy is not growing.
Here's an example of a stagflationary graph. In a stagflation, short-run aggregate supply shifts to the left. This is referred to as cost-push inflation. The price level equilibrium goes up, while the quantity real GDP equilibrium goes down. Price level is too low and unemployment is too high.